Conversations in Color. Brought to you in part by the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. Mora Beauchamp Byrd, Ph.D. and Katrina Andry, MFA. Healing through African American Art and Material Culture as Praxis.
Good evening, everyone. So, welcome to the third and final Conversations in Color event for this September. I see many of you have returned again to have time with us, but I see some new faces tonight. My name is Christopher Harder. I'm the Interim Executive Director at the Amistad Research Center. Before we begin our talk tonight, I'd like to thank the LEH for their sponsorship for these three talks this September. And before we begin our speakers, I'd like to invite our partners, New Orleans Airlift and Third Eye Theater, Monique Moss and Delaney Martin, to come and tell you about some additional events that are going to be coming up in October related to a collaborative project that we've all been a part of.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Monique Moss. I am Artistic Director of Third Eye Theater, Interdisciplinary and Improvisational Performance Arts Company. I am serving as the artistic director of the performative component of this work. And when I say this work, I'm speaking about Liberation Vibrations. And Liberation Vibrations is essentially the work of three organizations who came together collaboratively to work through, at a really critical juncture in time, racial inequality, injustice, ... And the three organizations are the one that I just mentioned, New Orleans Airlift and Amistad Research Center. We came together because we felt compelled as artists, as leaders of institutions, to make a valiant effort to evolve in light of what was happening politically, socially, globally. And so I will ask Delaney to share with you what the impetus was for us coming together initially.
Sure, some of you have been here, so I want to acknowledge that I have told this story, but we'll tell it again briefly tonight. We had a strange opportunity from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, unrequested, but randomly called, to take our work to Congo. What is our work? We are an artist-driven organization. I'm an artist, and we make quite large, deeply collaborative projects here in the city and abroad, but we are most known for our flagship project, Music Box Village, that's located in the Bywater. It's, in essence, a village built in harmony by many hands, where we have musical houses, performative instruments of musical architecture built by many artists, and we stage concerts there. We have panels, we have open hours where you can play with them. And when we got this opportunity, the Gates Foundation had seen that project and wondered what we could do in Congo to advance. I'm not quite sure what, but we knew that it was a deeply problematic invitation, and as a white transplant organization working here in Louisiana, and we sought the advice of native New Orleanians, including Ron Boucher, who has attended every talk, so thank you so much. We also worked with his wife, Troy Boucher, actually at the onset of this project, to do racial, not racial reconciliation, but racial awareness work with Monique, with our staff, with our board, and with Kara Olage, our other project partner leader, formerly of Amistad. At any rate, this was an interesting opportunity, and it went down the tubes because this was March of 2020 when we decided to select Monique and Kara to go to Congo. But post George Floyd, we reunited and looked at what we could do here in New Orleans. And one of the very first things Monique asked me to do was to research the lands that Music Box Village sits on. And it did not take very long at all to realize that in 1811, Manuel Andry, upon whose plantation the 1811 slave revolt started on the German coast, well, right after that, he abandoned his German coast plantation and he moved to the land that sits underneath Music Box. So in the context of a racial reconciliation project, this was heavy news. It felt deep. It felt like we were channeling something. I looked across the industrial canal from where we're located and saw that Charles Deslon, well, the Deslon plantation was there in 1811 and it is Deslon Street today. So all of this became a seed for this work around racial reconciliation. And in fact, I'm honored to have Katrina here tonight because she was an early person who we connected with over this land ancestry that we have inherited as occupiers of this land today. And it took me some courage to ask Katrina Andry if there might be a connection.
And so illuminating a little bit more on our connections to the Congo and also our connections to the 1811 slave revolt. Once Delaney was provided with this information, including a map that illustrated the location of the plantations in New Orleans, the Delon plantation, the Andry plantation, and then in the center track was the land where the Ursuline convent was. And so where you see the industrial canal today is where the Ursuline convent was. So this history is very, very rich. And I feel that it landed in our place at that time because we were ready. We were ready to move forward with seeking truth about history. And to add to that, I'm also one of the tour guides who has worked with Leon A. Waters for over a decade on the 1811 slave revolt. Leon A. Waters is the scholar on that subject. He is a descendant of one of the rebels, and he is the publisher of the first and foremost text on that history. And so here I stand, having received that information, and we take it and we give thanks. And this is what we're using as fodder for the work that we have been doing and we will be doing on October 8th. In addition, I have to mention Papa Tito Sampa and his brother Jean-Claude Biza Sampa, who are from Brazzaville, Congo. I traveled to the Kingdom of Congo with the two brothers in 2018, continuing to do research on connections between Congo and Congo Square here in New Orleans. And so with their spirit and their open hearts, they have been working with us to bridge and reconnect.
So this is the last in a series of panel talks that Amistad has organized around this project. But next week, we will be revealing at Music Box Village, the Mbongi Spirit House, which is a product of this collaboration, a musical house, but a house of healing that really channels a lot of indigenous practice, not just African and Congolese, but also Homa. We have several elder Homa artists and also like Black African-American traditions. So we will be unveiling that in a performance, and I would say a ritual performance that Monique is directing, and I hope that all of you can come. We have flyers, and we will hand them out at the end of this, and we will let these wonderful people talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Delaney and Monique. Our speakers this evening are Katrina Andry and Dr. Mora Beauchamp Byrd. Katrina Andry is a native of New Orleans. She received an MFA in printmaking in 2010 and currently lives in New Orleans and works in New Orleans, where she maintains a studio. Her work is often in dialogue with the viewer, asking them to confront their own race and gender biases and to consider how it affects the quality of life in their community writ large. Andry was listed in the September 2012 issue of Art and Print as one of the top 50 printmakers. She is recently shown at the Hammonds House Museum, the Pensacola Museum of Art, and the New Orleans Museum of Art. She has been an artist in resident at Anchor Graphics in Chicago, Kayla Art Institute in Berkeley, California, and the Joan Mitchell Center in New Orleans. Joining her this evening, Dr. Mora Beauchamp Byrd is a teaching assistant professor at Oklahoma State University, where she teaches courses in Africana Studies and in art history. As an art historian, curator, and arts administrator, she has taught at Duke University, Spelman College, the University of Tampa, and Xavier University of New Orleans. Since 2020, she has been a member of the board of directors of the College Art Association, where she currently serves on the executive committee as vice president for publications. She's held numerous curatorial and administrative positions at cultural and educational institutions, such as at the Amistad Research Center here in New Orleans, the Caribbean Cultural Center in New York, the Sterling and Francine Clark Art Institute, and the New Orleans African American Museum of Art, Culture, and History. Won't you please help me welcome Katrina Andry and Dr. Mora Beauchamp Byrd.
Thank you, Chris. It's really good to be here. I, first of all, want to thank you, Chris, who is serving as Deputy Director at the Amistad Research Center, and for inviting me here. The initial invitation came from Kara Olish, the former director, and I thank Chris for continuing to develop this program. I also want to thank Bernadette Guildspinell, who also assisted in facilitating my arrival here and dealing with logistics and everything. And I certainly want to thank Katrina Andry for allowing me to engage with her artwork once again, because I have been, as we'll talk about soon, looking at her work since about 2010. And I knew her and was speaking with her then. At that time. This is such an important moment for me. It's a homecoming of sorts, as I'll discuss, in our conversation today. I was raised in Reserve, right next to La Place, where the Andrew Plantation is. And also it's a homecoming because having worked with the amazing collection at the Amistad Research Center, this is one of the finest collections of art in this country, and I think does not get enough attention with the really wonderful 19th century African American work and Harlem Renaissance material that is in that collection. And I had the honor of working with that collection as curator. But I want to start, by talking about when Chris asked about, having this conversation with Katrina. And I was so excited because, I've admired your work since I first saw it, which was about 2010 or 2011. And preparing for this program gave me an opportunity to examine more recent work. And in some ways, it's a conversation between us, but it's also a conversation about your work that is in conversation with global art history. It's in conversation with the social and political concerns of the day. It's in conversation with the very distinctive particularities of New Orleans culture, particularly around race, and which is like no other, even though I can think of similarities in Brazil and other places, but there's something very distinctive about New Orleans culture around race, however challenging or troubling it is, or celebratory. And but before I get to the questions, I wanted to briefly explain to you what intrigues me about your work. Number one, I'm taken with the way that you engage with art history and with a broad range of references, visual cultural references, that range from histories of textiles, that range to Disney characters, that range to belief systems of the African diaspora, that range to looking at Christian iconography. For an art historian, it's particularly exciting to look at your work and think about, sort of deciphering and connecting with all of those cultural references there. The other thing that I'm intrigued by, which is why I wanted to have a picture of you in your studio, I don't know if you like that picture or not, but I thought it was a good picture, but your meticulous process of working. Every time I've gotten some kind of, something from social media about a show that you're in, I see that you are consistently working. I see that you are producing work that shows some extensive, rigorous research. And that excites me as a scholar. The other thing is that I noticed in some of my research on you that you had mentioned, having been inspired by the work of Adrian Piper. And that, was like a light bulb went up. It was so clear how much your work is dealing with this very layered kind of examination of issues like passing and colorism that are, very much a part of us being, natives of Louisiana. And so I just wanted to begin with that to give you a sense of the kinds of questions that we'll be discussing today. My first question has to do with your process. I think that looking at your work, particularly, the works that I saw when I first started, to examine, your prints, you talked about in a Bomb magazine article that you, quote, started digging into the history of woodcuts, how the technique was historically, used in Europe and Mexico, and thinking about how woodcuts were used for broadsides. This relationship to advertisement, something to pass on a message quickly, is what drew me to using woodcuts. And the first series I developed with this technique was called Otherness and American Values. So part of what I just said was a quote from you, from the Bomb magazine article. And I'm particularly drawn to your use of broadsides. I teach a course in history of graphic design, and I think that some of your work reminds me so much of that energetic potency, that immediacy and currency of 19th century political cartoons. I'm thinking of, for example, the Gilded Age artist and cartoonist Thomas Nast, whose works were published in Harper's Weekly. And I wanted to, ask you about what kinds of historical broadsides were you studying as you developed your earlier series?
Thanks for that question, Mora, and I'm excited to see you. I haven't seen you in over 10 years.
Yes.
So I'm excited about this conversation too.
She's the only one who stayed the same.
I keep trying to tell her it's not true. And I have 2 kids now also, and I'm not in my 20s anymore. Oh, well. But yeah, when I first started doing woodcut, I was doing other things before that. I was doing intaglio, I was doing lithograph, and I was really trying to develop my style at the same time. I was in grad school, and I love to draw. It's a part of my practice that I really feel like I can be calm and work very intuitively in that moment. And the way that I was drawing was without picking the pen up or really the brush, and very immediate, while also too understanding through art history how printmaking was initially used to pass on a message very quickly, whether it was to get society on the same page about something, to alert people to the plague, or to let people know how a war was going that was near them, or their country was fighting. And people didn't need to know how to read when they saw broadsides either. It was just about the messaging. And that was the same when I was looking at printing in Mexico too, during the Revolution. And I was really drawn to that, but I was particularly drawn to how broadsides were used to advertise runaway slaves and the messages that were in those broadsides. And also, too, the way that the way that the figures were drawn and carved, it was really rough and ready. They're using woodblock type also, too. Everything's done very hurriedly. And the way that they were describing the people that they were looking for, and they were using descriptions like sullen or, sullen but violent, unusually broad nose. It's things that it's mannerisms and stereotypes that still hang on today to how how society sees and views Black folks at times. So when I was working on that series, which are all about stereotypes, right, and really satirically narrating them so that the viewer can also see just how absurd that they are and how arbitrary that they are, that we have them. I was looking at and how absurd and arbitrary, these broadsides were in American history also too. But first interested in them, of course, when I saw how they were used historically in Mexico and in Europe.
Like with the Talla de Grafica Popular, I was thinking that might have been an inspiration as well in Mexico. The other question I had was about, you brought up that you were looking at advertisements for runaway enslaved Africans, and the artist Charles White was also looking at that, particularly in his Wanted poster series, where he references the sort of crinkles and this worn quality of the old newspapers that he was going through. Were you looking at Charles White's work as well, and for some of that?
I actually didn't know about him till after, till like many years after. And his work is so beautiful. Like, I really like his work, but I didn't know about it at the time.
Yeah, and that's what it made me think of. Before we go to that second slide, I know that this conversation, when it was first conceived, was about thinking about how art might serve as a healing practice. And I think that much of your work deals with issues that, for example, like colorism or stereotype or gentrification, for example. And I'm wondering, because you talked about in that same article, the meditative aspects of lithography and intaglio printmaking practices, as well as, quote, the alchemy behind them. How does your work and the process of producing your work serve as a healing practice for you?
For me, it comes by the time I get to the studio, and it's just the way my brain works, I've planned so much out by the time I get there that when I'm working, it feels very much intuitive. I've already tricked my family members into posing for me for imagery that I need. I've already collaged stuff in Photoshop. I've already gone out and documented images that I want to use. I've got my playlist going, and it's me drawing on the wood and then carving the wood. And for me, carving, now I've been doing it for so long, is like knitting. It's a motion that, it's repetitive now. So it brings me to a state that does feel very relaxing when I'm there. Leading up to it is not so relaxing, but getting there is very relaxing. So that part is. And the collaboration, too, you were speaking about the litho and the intaglio that hopefully get back to litho. I just got a litho press. Thank you, NPN's grant. But the cooperation and the collaboration that you need to do with printmaking, the amount of letting go that you need to do personally in order to not be so frustrated with the medium. Also, for me, it triggers relaxation, because there's stuff I can control and there's stuff that I cannot control.
Yeah, and everything you've described is a ritual, of preparing. You're conceptualizing because there's something that is so concept-driven in the work, and that's what I find so insightful. But what you talked about in terms of preparing and getting ready and getting your family ready and everything is, definitely key to that process as well. And part of when I asked you that question, I was also thinking about healing in terms of the audience as well. Did you feel that speaking about these issues through the narratives, and even though, some of the work can be very codified, and that's what I like about it, that it makes you work to get, at the ideas behind it. But there is something that is healing about airing this, this dirty laundry, that's airing these challenges about this history, around race. I want to go to, all right. So we've kind of talked about this a bit today, and a few weeks ago, we had a discussion, and you mentioned that you would be engaging with, your family's connection to the history of the Andry plantation in Laplace. When you told me that, I said, where is that? But I didn't realize that we call it the Woodland Plantation. I see Renee nodding there. Also know it as what is now the really a historic home that is dedicated to the jazz musician Kid Ory, whose family lived at the plantation, where there's a couple of images that I have here, and an image of Kid Ory with Hot Five with Louis Armstrong's, a band there. And so what's important and being discussed in a lot of scholarship now, but also in terms of artists, and it's particularly important for, your engagement, is that German Coast Uprising of 1811 in St. John, that started at the Andry Plantation, which has been called the largest insurrection of the large, oh, sorry. Could y'all hear me at all? Okay. All right. I'm used to the pin it to you kind of thing. Sorry. It has been called the largest insurrection of enslaved Africans in the U.S. And just to, and I know most, everyone here, knows about this history, but you produced some works that, let me, a series of works. I've seen 4 from the series, but I don't know if there are other ones that are in that series as well. But I wanted to ask you, what prompted you to examine this history at the time, and are there other works from the series?
So I didn't know about the Andry Plantation until right around when I moved back to New Orleans. NPR did a book review. This guy wrote a book in 2010 about it, and then I was like, where's that? Laplace, up the road? The Andry Plantation, largest revolt. So I was just curious about it, and I had started investigating loosely around that time, but really like amped up pre-COVID, when I had an interesting encounter at a party, and then had a chance to meet the person who bought the dilapidated plantation, but not before this man from France reached out to me swearing we were cousins, and he's the great nephew of Manuel Andry.
Wow.
Came from France, had been coming to New Orleans for a minute, but made a trip just to visit, and then just to visit that plantation at that time. My dad's been doing some ancestry research, and the guy, while we were there, found like old logs, really, actually, in the attic,
wow.
that my dad has been using too and researching.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, okay, so what did I was curious before, and my friends teased me because, even growing up and people wanted to go visit plantations, go to Oak Alley, go here, go there, and I'm just like, I just want to burn it down. And so they were right during COVID, at the beginning of COVID, there were a couple of plantations that caught on fire. Like in Mississippi, there was one in Mississippi, I think past Christiane, there was one, and there were like 3. And I would get messages from my group like, are you burning down plantations?
Okay.
I was like, I wish that were me. But I did learn one of the intentions of the groups of folks that were marching from that plantation to New Orleans, and of course they were inspired by the Haitian Revolution and all the things that came with that. One of their intentions was to burn down every plantation along River Road on their march to freedom. And so, as my dad is doing ancestry work, and I see, and Mr. Birch is here, who told me I would put my children in work one day, and I was like, I will never, and then I did. But burning down plantations. So I hope that is an appropriate act for my kids in these works. But just fulfilling what I've been calling sort of like a reimagining of history and Afro-Woodism. Like, what if this happened?
Yeah.
What? And
Afrofuturist kind of.
Afro-what if? So, and that's what these prints have been about. There may be a company, it's still in the works, so you've seen the 4 that I've done. There's 2 more that I'm working on for an exhibition, and there may be an installation component to it as well. But
All right, so here are 2 of them, and then here are the other 2 that I've seen as well. And I wanted to ask you about them. With all of them, there are, as you can see, these sort of green tongues of flame that's happening there, and certainly I read that as a reference to the fires during the uprisings, the plantations that were burned. Are these green-hued flames meant to evoke an additional form of flora that has, albeit subversively, blossomed in that space? Is that what you were thinking about?
that was so. It accidentally played into that way. I liked how when I did it, it played into it kind of grass coming up, but I intended it to be fire. And I didn't want the fire to be the forefront. I wanted the either nonchalant or the children who are joyful in the prints to be the forefronts of these works. And it's a collaboration with the medium. Printing on the black paper, when you mix a little yellow with a little black, turns a little green.
Okay.
And it wasn't something I minded. I felt that it helped to ground the print as well, to have that landscape fire. Mm-hmm. And I kept it.
And I was just going everywhere. I was like, these flames that were like, the flowers that have sprung up. And then I was going with money, associations with money and capitalism. I was going all over the place.
No, I love it.
With this. You said that's okay. And for these images, is this your son? Okay.
Yes.
So there's that referencing of the family. The other thing I was curious about is the bubbles. They have this, opaque quality that is strikingly reminiscent of the interiors of oyster shells. And so I was wondering, are they specifically referring to oyster shells in particular?
And they're not my children at the time anyway loved blowing bubbles, and my work is not usually joyful, but this Afro-Woodism, I really wanted that joy and playfulness to come through. And so the bubbles with, Moses, the one over here kind of holding the flame, mm-hmm. is actively joyful and running like kids do.
Yeah.
And Luke, the one over here, is blowing bubbles, and the bubbles they're iridescent, they're playful, they're fun. And that is how he is, he's activated in that work that way.
And I see you've got some sugarcane stalks in there too.
Yeah, there's symbolism of the South and of plantation life in all of the prints.
And that's magnolias. Yep. So I was sitting there deciphering and making diagrams of, what various components, were about. I wanted to go to this image. Much of your work has been he's about to kill me because I keep doing this. But, all right. Much of your work has been marked by vibrant colors and a complex use of texture and patterning. When you completed this series from around 2009, was this the period, sort of your last period where you were dealing with, this sort of black and white imagery? I know that, this is self-portraiture. There's something that's sort of blurry about, this look at identity, this look at, at your face. And what prompted, this seems to be the last series that I've seen before you went into, a much more, colorful kind of style in various series. Was there something about this series that prompted you to make that shift?
So for this, I made a roughly 75 self-portraits using lithograph. And it came around the end of when I was working on Otherness and American Values, the series where people are either in black or watermelon face. And I was that series is all about collective experience, collective consciousness. It's not about one singular experience. It's about the experience of a group of people. And hearing, American individualism and how individualism conquers all. And this was just my, I'm tired of people talking about individualism. So I made 75 self-portraits. None of them look alike, and they're all me. And it doesn't matter that they're all me. You can tell in all of them that it's a black woman. It is, and I didn't put a name on it. It is a nameless black woman. And it's how I felt at the end of making that work. Individualism be damned if we have experiences we can talk about that we can share based in race, ethnicity, and gender.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. This series I had not seen before recently. I'm Not Your Chocolate Fantasy, it's called, from 2016. So on one hand, it relates to the kind of patterning that I've seen in so many series in your work. But it felt like a continuation of what I feel there is an engagement with the decorative in many of your work. I know that there's so much study around printmaking processes, but for this one, I kept thinking about wallpaper design and that kind of engagement with race in wallpaper design. What was your thinking when you first started conceptualizing this series?
So really this series I made, and in the background is all, I made this work, I drew this work when I was pregnant. And, maybe TMI, I don't know. I didn't feel very pretty when I was pregnant. I gained a lot of weight. My face was a mess. My hair was falling out. And so I started experimenting with using makeup and was feeling very frustrated that the descriptives used for makeup for people of color were edible. And it emphasized this otherness that I was already feeling, this consumption of blackness, of whether it's black culture, but then also the destruction of it when you eat something. And so I was feeling some kind of way about it, and I made this series about it. And the background is usually, it's coffee, it's birds of paradise. I'm still using symbolism to kind of take in something. It's sage, this. I was getting a lot too when I was pregnant, feeling like I knew more than I actually did. But black women are so strong, and y'all always know what to do. And I was like, I have no idea what to do. And my uterus is gonna fall out at any second. I didn't feel those things, and so I wanted to put those things in that print in particular. I wanted to humanize myself, and then I was feeling the consumption of blackness was present more at that time for me. Yeah.
Yeah, and it you know, I talked about wallpaper, but that it feels also like textile for me, and that is something that runs through so many, you know, series in your work. Now, this series from 2018, it brought up a lot of references for me that some of them that have to do with New Orleans and some of them that have to do with art history in general. And so this series, this is a series of large scale, you know, color reduction prints. And you see these figures that are falling into a body of water and transforming into eel-like forms. You know, at first I read them as fish, but eel-like forms. And for me, the first thing that comes up, of course, is the Middle Passage, you know, in which, you know, enslaved Africans were, you know, thrown overboard, you know, during the transatlantic slave trade. But, and that's, in that way, that was the first thing that I thought about. And then I started to think about references to that in art history. First of all, J.M.W. Turner's slave ship that from 1840, and the way that, you know, that image is often referred to as an abolitionist image. You know, the full title of it is called Slavers Throwing Overboard the Dead and Dying, Typhoon Coming On. And you see this stormy sky. When I teach this in my classes, I asked them, what do they see? I don't, you know, before I showed them the title. And I said, what's going on in this picture? And they're looking and looking, and they'll say, oh, there's a boat, blah, blah, blah. Something's going on over there, you know, in the foreground. And they finally start to see legs and limbs, other kinds of limbs, and fish, you know, swarming about. And so when I saw your image, you know, I definitely thought about this work, but then I also thought about what's happening now in this whole discussion about the mermaid, right? And in particular, the Mami Wata figure in the African diaspora. So what you're looking at there at the bottom is a book by the art historian Henry Druell on Mami Wata, and there's several very important articles as well. Mami Wata is an aquatic water spirit that you'll find it in belief systems in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Togo, in Angola, and other places. You'll also find it throughout the African diaspora. You'll find it in Haiti, in Brazil, and other places. And this is a water spirit that is regarded as a foreign entity, you know, a woman who is a sort of mermaid figure that is exotic, that is mixed race. She is associated with monetary wealth and with otherness. And she's drawn from indigenous belief systems around water spirits that are often represented as, you know, as eels or snakes or fish. And so this was very strong in looking at these images. And how much did, you know, were you thinking about Mami Wata in particular, or about the Turner image?
So originally when I made this work, I had made right before it a series called Depose and Dispose of, which I made in response to the killing of Alton Sterling. And what I was hearing around that time, televised how, you know, you overhear the policemen are looking for somebody, and what they were using to describe. And, I heard someone say, well, there's that big bear. But they weren't talking about Alton Sterling, they were talking about somebody else. And then I started thinking about how other non-human descriptions placed on Black folks, dehumanizing them, and then the very unhuman treatment that is put on our bodies. I mean, so I made a series where there was a bull, there's a barracuda, there was a stallion, there was a raccoon, there was a gorilla, and this work I wanted to bring it full circle to make that historical reference to that too. Like, this isn't new, this was now. I mean, this isn't new, this was then too. And at the time, I mean, my husband, bless him with our kids, is part Japanese, and we were watching a series on TV about eels. And it was really just about how in the West, we don't know anything about them. We're not curious about them. We don't even, we barely know what they eat, and we're revolted by them. Mm. And he had a very different reaction to seeing an eel on TV. They're cute. We have them as pets. We eat them. And I started to think about, as I was thinking about this Middle Passage work, the origin of eels, and I had already had this anthropomorphic series that I had already produced, and thinking about the origin of eels as people that have fallen over during the Middle Passage. When I think about Turner's painting in particular, and people having been thrown over, as I was doing some research about that, the enslavers and even the doctors on board called what they called fixed melancholy. Enslaved people made themselves feel so sick about being enslaved. Really what they had was dysentery most of the time. Yeah. And so then they thought that was this melancholy was contagious, and they threw people over for it. They threw people over for various reasons.
Insurance too.
Well,
just to get some insurance money more than what you would.
But I mean, yeah. I feel like I think that was only certain countries that would offer that. It wasn't everybody that was extracting from the coast, or from that area, not from the coast really. But at any rate, and they're like between 5 and 20% of people were lost. They call the cargo. They don't know 200,000 or 2 million people. So it was really it's sad to hear, and in my way, I tried to make it a mythology about the origin of eels, as people having been overthrown during the Middle Passage, or lives lost, and be an anthropomorphic, them being anthropomorphized, emphasizing how they were seen as not human anyway. I mean, you have this condition only you would get because your fate is to be enslaved. Like, why wouldn't you want? So that's what I was thinking about when I was working on this series. And I had it's the promise, and it's titled The Promise of the Rainbow Never Came. Mm-hmm. And it was shown for the first time what Depose and Dispose Of, because Depose and Dispose Of is the now in response to Alton Sterling's death. The Promise of the Rainbow Never Came is a depiction of what was happening then. This promise of freedom after slavery, this promise of freedom after the Civil Rights Act passing, this promise of individualism and freedom in this country that must be promised to somebody else because it's not promised to us. A promise unfulfilled from the very beginning.
And it's interesting, you are speaking about this transformation as something that could possibly be hopeful, as something that could possibly be positive, in terms of thinking about, belief systems, for, what's happening here. And there's something that is, I look at the Turner, and there's a darkness there, an ominous quality. And I don't see that in yours. There is definitely, this sense of, you're using some of the colors of pastel colors, but there's some exuberance that's happening in this work as well. I, of course, also thought about, relationships, thinking about Katrina with this series as well. and the work of Emma Amos, who was just passed away in 2020, a very important American artist that was part of a group of African-American artists called Spiral in the 1960s. But for most of her career, I've known her work, these large-scale images of falling figures. And then there's an incorporation of portraiture in some of the work as well. Was Emma Amos someone that you were thinking about with that series as well?
Unfortunately, no. It wasn't. And I know I had the components where there are lots of falling figures that are mirrored, that accompanied that work, so people could see themselves in that work. But I had not known about Emma Amos.
And I also, you know, that use of textiles around it too. I think that's something that resonates with a lot of your work, with, you know, the patterning as well. But that's what I was thinking about when I looked at those works. And then this is a series called Colonial Colorism Influences in the Black Community. Am I saying that's right? Okay. And these were about 2019, 2020. And I'm fascinated by these as well. You know, there's a number of works in the series. These are just two from that series. At the left, you see a reference to the paper bag tests, which, you know, being from here, you know all about that. And also the references, I want to talk about the bird in a moment, but there's that, you know, teacup there that represents a kind of gentility, is what I was reading it as. On the right, you see a woman in a tignon, and she's got the Trinity in her hand, right? And there's a perfume bottle. I didn't know if that was a reference to plissage. That sort of prettying yourself up and getting ready. You know, I didn't know for sure. But, you know, I had an interesting time thinking about these works. But what was striking was that suddenly your work had this Black background that was not common in your earlier series. And so what brought about that shift with this series?
I really wanted to, I wanted to try to print on Black. I like how colors pop on Black. I like how I started to just put one figure in the work instead of two figures in conversation and work. And I just like how Black kind of like pushes works forward. There's also a mystery behind printmaking that people, you know, people always like, well, what is it? Are you making copies of a work? And I think it's pretty clear you can't copy on Black paper also, you know, so there were some practical reasons why I wanted to do that too, but I just like the way color pops off of it. It's easy to see how shiny the ink actually is. It's just pretty. And I mean, and first and foremost, you were talking about the work from the other series, and you know, it's hard. There are hard things in it, but it's not hard to look at, and that's important to me. Like, it's important for me. It's important for me to draw a person into the work by being. You want to look at it because it might be pretty. It's engaging in a way that is counting on you thinking that it's nice to look at, and then until it's not.
Yeah, and then you start looking at the symbolism after that. You've drawn in, you know, and that engagement, you know, with the decorative or, you know, is very strong there. Now, I know that you've talked about this series, and you talked about, you know, the sort of color caste system within the Black community, particularly what happens here has happened here in Louisiana, that in which free people of color were more likely to be, quote, related to the slave-holding class and therefore lighter-skinned. And so some of the imagery in this series, there's other ones. I think I've seen about 4 other images from it, or is it more than that?
There's
Is it total 6?
Yeah.
Okay. And is this, were you basically looking at paintings that, to get particular faces or individuals. I mean, I didn't know if this was a family member, or if you were looking at some of the paintings that might be, some of the 19th century paintings of women in Tignons that.
Oh, this is Lena Horne over here.
And
that's me because it was done during pandemic times. It was
Okay.
supposed to be my sister,
Okay.
but then we weren't seeing each other.
Okay, okay.
But so it can be my sister. We look enough alike.
Yeah, yeah. I wasn't sure. I just like I had to ask you about, is this your son in the picture? I had to. But I just, this is something that's so specific to New Orleans. The other thing I thought about with that turn to a Black background, were you thinking about Black velvet paintings as well?
I wasn't.
Of the 70s?
Right, yeah,
You
I
guys
know.
what.
When I saw you, I was like, oh man, I was like, I miss looking at those.
Me too.
What do those look like?
I was just wondering, it just brought up some memories for
It
me.
made me think of my grandmother's house. She had a bunch of those.
Yeah.
With like, what they thought was like Chinese art on the background. Like everybody's grandma.
Everyone had some kind of Black paintings, some kind of romanticized images on there. And this is a series called Sirens of Decay from about 2019. I think there might be one that's 2020, if I'm. And I am particularly intrigued by these works. These are images of Black women as sirens, these ancient seductive figures that'll lure you to your death, that'll lure men to their death. And so, for example, on the right is Fabricated Satyrs, Distracted Desires from 2019. You see a brown-skinned woman that, you see the torso of her emerging from what appears to be a bird's nest. And her face is sporting, a kind of grimace there, or a Cheshire cat smile. And then she has a forked tongue. And she is nursing a satyr infant. And in this series, I was immediately drawn to the references to, the satyrs that accompanied Dionysus in Greek mythology, or Bacchus, same figure in Roman iconography. And so you've got grapes here up there at the top. And Dionysus or Bacchus is this god of pleasure seeking, wine, revelry, sexual references, fertility, ritual ecstasy. And we know all about Bacchus here. And so, I know that this series is about looking at the kind of stereotypical representations around Black women who have been in, popular culture hypersexualized, And so looking at these works, I had a couple of questions about the actual, the physicality of them, where that came from. On one hand, I'm wondering about the bird's nest. Now, I know birds are figuring prominently in various series with you. Can you talk about that, your references to birds that comes up in images with women?
Oh, yeah, yes. Well, for this series, the birds, the sirens, the half woman, the half bird, and nesting home, I'm doing a series about gentrification. It's referencing the house, referencing the home. Mm-hmm. And these, yes, the Bacchus, the wine, the satyr, child, just how people, what do you think about when you think about a good neighbor? How people enter neighborhoods, how a lot of Black women are the heads of their households, and how when I was in Charleston, there was a lot of, this work was made for the housing in Charleston, and there was a lot of talk around gentrification in Charleston happening at the moment There's a lot of development happening. A lot of Black neighborhoods are really close to downtown Charleston. The AME Church, I didn't realize that happened the year before I arrived, and it's in the middle of Charleston. I thought, when I thought, when I saw that, and I thought that, I was like, oh, Charleston's real rural. That must be somewhere, nobody, they went to the backwoods and that's how that happened. No, this would be like if it happened at St. Louis Cathedral.
Wow.
It's that central to Charleston. And so there was a very important publication that had come out about 5 years before I went to Charleston. And I went around, I really collaborated. This work, I call it in collaboration with the Avery Center that's in Charleston. I was able to meet with activists and thought leaders in Charleston. And Darren, who's at the Avery, brought me around to different neighborhoods and told me the stories of those neighborhoods, was able to tell me about like the first and only surviving Black bank in Charleston and where it is. And it's a shotgun building, y'all. It's tiny, but just kind of how more prominent, in New Orleans we have Creoles, and in Charleston they have the Browns, right? This sort of sister citying that is happening between Charleston and New Orleans. Yeah. And so these works were really in collaboration with the folks that I had seen there, and some folks that I had met that were in the equal housing opportunity movement there, and just how Black folks are being driven out of their properties in droves, how the historical society was had a hand in it, because if you couldn't upkeep your house, then the taxes, whatever, your house could get taken away from you. How a lot of Black folks in Charleston owned homes, but they didn't have deeds because they owned the homes forever, and people were sweeping in and taking their homes, and it was marked. You could walk down main streets in Charleston and see the homes marked that had been taken over because of this. So it was very present in that time. And it seemed so much so in the Black community, it seemed targeted. And then you could see the development that came in. And so this idea of like, what makes a good neighbor? Yeah. What makes a desirable neighborhood? And why would you want to drive folks that have lived in those neighborhoods forever out? And so this work really came out of that work with them.
Okay. And I did wonder about the bird's nest. To me, it also, because of the texture of it and the color, remind me of raffia, the skirt for masquerading in various cultures on the continent of Africa. And so I don't know if that came into play, or you really just focused on it as a bird's nest. What do you think?
I'm really focused on it as a bird's nest. I feel like
So
half of my answers are like very disappointing. It's just a bird's nest.
It's just a bird's nest. And then two of the works from your series, the one with the hands there, the feigned fear of the manufactured chicken head. I want to talk about your titles too. And then this work, Mother Medusa, to me, I immediately thought of Guillermo del Toro's Pan's Labyrinth film, and this figure called the Pale Man from the film. Have a lot of you seen that film? It's amazing, from 2006. And there was something that reminded me of that very scary character who would take his eyes and put them in or have them out. And then the fawn, also from Pan's Labyrinth, reminded me of this figure here. I know that with this piece, when you were thinking about these representations of Black women that are harmful and stereotypical, and you were thinking about the monstrous, so you have this title where you're looking at sirens, but you're also looking at other kinds of creatures, in crafting this series. Was this film something that you were thinking about in the representation of these works?
For the Medusa work, yes. For the work below, not as much. I was looking at images. I was thinking like Chronicles of Narnia. I was looking at like images of from there. But what the one with the hands, the eyes and the hands, was the first one that I created in this series. And really, she's a Medusa figure, and the snakes have lots of eyes. Mm-hmm. But the eyes in the hand, in mythology, and in like in the occult, and I'm like, yeah, I don't know. I pull cards, it's fun to pull a tarot sometimes. They have eyes and hands, but it's a portal to death. It's a guide to the other world. The creatures with the hands in their eyes. And it is this also too in Pan's Labyrinth. Mm-hmm. She doesn't know yet what is happening, but we know how that movie ends. I won't spoil it for y'all.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was thinking of him and thinking of how that relates to the sirens calling you to your death, and how that symbol also is a calling to the other world, the hand and the eye. And I remember that I was telling Chris, the only thing I remember about this movie called The Gate from the 80s that I saw is at the end, the little boy has an eye in his hand, and he's screaming, he's terrified. And I was thinking about that too. And I was also just like, well, snakes are coming out of her eyes, but where are her eyes?
Yeah.
Okay, they're going to be in her hands. Yeah.
It would be terrifying. And so what you're seeing at left is an installation. This is also at the Halsey Institute at the College of Charleston, where you had, this show, and you produced an installation that's this large-scale, panoramic view of Charleston's east side. And as you walk there are actually mirrored profile figures there, so you could see your face. Is that correct? From the pictures that I could see. And, thinking about gentrification that was happening in Charleston. So most of your work has engaged with New Orleans or Louisiana history. So in this installation, number one, you're turning to installation. There's that shift. But you're also turning to looking at another city. And for me, Charleston does feel very similar to some of, this sort of port city with a, challenging history. There's a new museum that's opening there now to deal with some of that history. And how was that experience in really engaging with Charleston? You kind of talked about some of that and working with the Avery Center. What was that experience like, and your process in selecting the neighborhood views that would be featured in this installation?
I was skeptical at first. I really don't like collaborations. I avoid them on purpose, and it was wonderful working with the Avery Center and with the Halsey, actually. I didn't expect to make a wallpaper piece for this exhibition at all. I had made an installation work about family and loss, and I had made these prints about gentrification, and then I kind of thought that was it. They could move the walls wherever they move the walls to make it all fit and happen. And this work organically came out of I went to Charleston for each time. I was there for almost 2 weeks, and I went there twice, plus the time, setting up and installing, and felt embedded in that. They really they took me on in a way that made me feel embedded in that community. I also really felt when I was coming into Charleston, I kind of also have issue when folks come to New Orleans, make a work about New Orleans, and then they're off. So I didn't want to be that person.
Yeah.
So it was difficult. I asked them to. I was like, "This is coming out of it," and they were excited about it. And like we scheduled a talk to talk about it. They were that excited about it. So And it was important, I think, for me, the what I feel like I put into that work was the mirrored pieces. I wanted folks that came, which I knew would be a mainly white audience that would come, to that space, is on the College of Charleston's campus, to see themselves in these neighborhoods that are thriving without them. Like, they don't live in those neighborhoods, but these folks are being pushed out, and these neighborhoods are thriving without them.
Yeah.
So that's, that was, I feel like, my contribution to this, and still to that piece. And the Avery Center is like hidden in the corn in the red part.
Okay.
Behind the rose bush.
I was a little surprised when I saw installations, but then I had to think I shouldn't be surprised, because monumentality and large scale has been a huge part of your work from the very beginning, from the first things that I saw. And so are you planning on more installation work now?
I am. I got kind of really excited about the cut acrylic, the mirrored cut acrylic that I first did with The Promise of the Rainbow Never Came, and then with the work at the Halsey. And just how can I work that into a wall, onto the floor, onto different surfaces. And also, too, I don't know if y'all remember, and this might not ever come, don't hold me to it, but in between printed billboards and digital billboards, there were these really funky 3D billboards that would like turn.
I remember. Y'all remember too?
They're in printmaking, I forget like the book form that they're called, but I was like, this is cool. How can I, anyway, that might, I don't know.
It might show up.
It might show up, but don't hold me to it.
Okay.
I know it sounds cheesy, but I don't know. We'll try to make it cool.
And I don't know how we're on time, Chris. I just wanted to ask what she's working on now. What are you working on now?
Right now I'm working on that, the 1811 uprising work. I'm also working, well, once that is done and is very near completion, I started thinking about how, if there was a connection, and the Amistad Research Center will likely help me out on this because I don't know. And if I'm wrong, great, it's just a hunch, between the closing of Black hospitals and Black medical schools and the upcoming of teaching hospitals in Black neighborhoods, and sort of how that affected Black folks' relationship to the medical field. So I'm hoping that, I have some hunches.
I see Chris
but-
nodding, so I think they will be able to. Chris, how much time do we have for questions?
We've got maybe about 15 minutes. So, and if we want to go ahead and open it up to questions, we're going to ask audience members on the right, if you wouldn't mind moving towards the outside, and the speaker up front. And then folks here on the left side, I'm going to circulate the floating mic.
Okay. You guys have any questions?
Actually, I'll start off. You were talking about the fire and how the color, the green, came about almost by accident. Katrina, I was just curious, is there a role of kind of accident and happenstance in your work that gives you results that you weren't necessarily originally intending?
Absolutely. I mean, printmaking, woodcut, intaglio, litho, there is a collaboration between the medium that happens, because you can't, for instance, I don't print downstairs if it's a certain humidity. The ink won't lay right, my paper has swollen, or my paper has contracted too much. So there is a collaboration with environment, and there's also a collaboration with the medium. There's chatter in the wood that pops up that's not always, you don't always see it coming. And the chatter, I mean, is whenever there's like those little vibrations of ink that show up in work, is not on purpose, and I don't mind it. I feel like in a lot of ways I can be a control freak around what I'm going to eat for dinner, like how, shoes I might wear, I might like, where are they? But in the studio, I let go of some of that. The image and how I draw, I can control. How it prints, no matter what the printmaking medium, always a little surprise always comes up. And if it's a bad one, I throw the work away. But I don't go on and I'm like, oh well, if it looks terrible, then no, I fix it. But it's usually okay. Yeah.
Over on the right side.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm not an art historian, but I am an historian. And I was admiring the eel images. And you all were emphasizing the throwing overboard of the captured people. And I was thinking actually about the I hate to say voluntary because it's an exploitative system, but the choice to throw oneself overboard as an act of resistance, a radical act of resistance in seeking perhaps freedom in the ocean or a return to the mother continent, and the idea of the ocean goddess cradling and holding the poor person who jumped overboard. So I wanted to know if you had any desire to address that. I teach a Black radicalism class, and we talk a lot about resistance. And that's the first thing I saw in these beautiful prints, resistance. So thank you.
Thank you for your question. So there are not a lot of, at least what I could find, there weren't a lot of logs that even documented sort of how when it happened on voyage. There's more like there's more people missing right at the beginning of a voyage, like people's attempts to flee like right as they're leaving dock, but not as many as that I could find that in the middle of the water. But I love that, and I had thought that too, and I thought that there would be more research around that and sort of that happening, and then also to a term that, of course, like the British or the Europeans would put on it because they were trying to figure everything out. And it's not something that that I found in particular, but I do think I like the idea of resistance, and I like the idea of a new beginning. I think, if anything, the eels for me would represent like just sort of this new beginning as an animal that revolts people and nobody's curious about, as this othering in the ocean, but maybe a safer othering than what was happening. But it's an attempt, all of my works really are an attempt to portray us as human beings. And human beings are soft, our skin breaks, we're vulnerable. I am not a strong Black woman, I am a woman. I cry, I laugh. When I fall, I bruise. My skin is really thin. So it's whether it's satirical or humorous or defiant, it's still, my goal is human. My goal is I'm human. I'm not a superhuman or even like a half human.
So here, Katrina, thank you for being here. I'm glad that these two images are actually up because they are the two that I wanted to ask you about as well. So when we look at the image on the right and we see the typical iconography of mermaid, albeit La Sirène or Mamewata or other, it's, in my mind, easy today to romanticize and exotify that imagery and not delve past that, not spiritually, not historically, or any other way. And so we have the Little Mermaid, and we have all the little girls with their little costumes and things going on, right? But then when you look at the left, and it really took me a while to read it all, absorb it all. And it helped having the juxtaposition. But when I look at the head of the being entering the water, leaving behind the bottom half of the physical human self, I feel at first disturbed, but then I feel a sense of incredible power, spiritual power, agency, return to element, nature, true environment, and leaving behind on top of the water the part that is objectified, sensationalized often, those parts of the female physiological self. But what's entering the water is so just powerful to me that I feel a sense of leaving the physical realm. The fish is clearly still within the physical realm, but I feel a sense of metaphysicalness, happening in that image. And I really appreciate having the challenge to invert the situation. And so on the left, I don't feel the sense of romanticism. I feel a sense of incredible returning home. And I would like if you would just speak a little bit about the meaning in this work for you.
This series, and I get what you're saying totally too, because you're seeing the face of the eel, and the eel is calm and looks okay. It's not in a state of stress. It's just like it's going back to something, not being thrown into something, which that feeling for me came about because I am also too thinking about the origin story of how we got eels in the first place. This evolving, or not evolving, but change. So, but this work, the whole series I was making as I was making the Posed and Disposed of, and thinking about just full circle the dehumanization of Black folks from leaving the continent to Alton Sterling's death. So this work was, The Promise of the Rainbow Never Came. I named it after making the other work that was in response to that happening of the promise of freedom, the promise of freedom never came.
And I'm going to add, just for me, as a topper, I look at the curve in the body. On the top, it's as if it's something being discarded, not wanted, the way that it's just out of control of its own self. But then once it goes beneath the water, en bas de l'eau, it is absolutely in alignment with its natural curvature. And so for me, it's moving from disorientation and discard to natural element. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add something to what you're saying, and I'm happy that you are really engaging with that work, because I was very struck by them too. But and I liked how you said that the eel form is calm, and really that eel form is the one. It's two different forms. That top part is not going to survive in that water, but the eel is built to survive in that water. And so there's that too in this idea of survival that's happening in that piece as well. I see someone else has a question.
I saw Mr. Birch had his. Oh, she's gonna. Okay, she's gonna. Oh, hi.
Hello. Howard. My question is actually in relation to where the conversation began, where you talked about the immediacy of the type of printmaking, the woodcut, which I found striking because in the 21st century, I think often forms of art that are connected with immediacy tend to be photographic or time-based media or video, or basically not necessarily printmaking. So my question to you is, what makes this form of art so appealing to you, and whether or not you've ever had any temptation to engage in these same concepts utilizing more photography or time-based media?
Thank you for your question. So yes, I've started to paint. I did make a video a long time ago, an animation of my prints interacting with each other. And it was, and I still have it, it was being shown at the Isaac Gallery at Tampa, and it was censored, and that was the last time I think it was ever shown. Yeah, it showed for like 20 minutes, and they didn't think their audience could handle it.
Now I want to see it.
And it's short, it's like a 30-second video. And there's nothing crude in it. But you know, once, you know, I don't know. But I have thought about other mediums, but I like I'm just so, like it's when I get to the studio and my hand, you know, my hand can just move. And then I look at it and be like, okay, now I'm gonna carve. And that both are just very meditative for me, very peaceful. I haven't thought about it in photography though. I like taking photographs because I use a lot of reference. I never know if it's gonna pop up as a reference image in my work. You know, I'll stop on my walks and take photographs of all kinds of things just because I don't know if it'll show up in my work as a reference. But.
Marita, you took my question, but I'm over here, I'm sorry. I guess I was thinking it's nothing really immediate about this particular form that you use and this technique because it's labor intensive. I mean, how much work goes into, how much carving goes into this particular kind of making of a print is enormous. And I agree with you about the meditation aspect of it. But I guess my part of the question would be, you know, I was going to ask about why, when there are so many other printmaking forms that are far more immediate, even just to make the drawings. Why the print?
Well, I fell in love with printmaking in school, and then, as you know, when I got out of school, I couldn't find, you know, you can't do it anywhere unless you have a press. And not unlike John Scott, I was like printing with spoons and stepping on my work to print it. I just felt I was drawn to it over and over again. It was a challenge at first, and all art. I mean, my first love is probably litho, but I didn't have anywhere to do litho up until very recently, and I can't wait to get back into it. But yeah, just I like the practice it takes to get down to it, and that's really any art form, really, right? The practice to master it. And I don't think I've mastered printmaking at all, but I like practicing it, and so I keep coming back to it. And I'm working on the painting that is like taking forever, and I'm like, And I do really like drawing my work also, and that might be something I start practicing again too, just drawing. They tend to, for me, to not be as interesting as my prints because it's very classical. It's not very stylized, but it's just getting there and practicing that too.
Okay, how you do?
Hello.
Thank you. This was a beautiful presentation, and thank you, Ms. Beauchamp. I have first a thought of that the doctor said your work is decorative. Well, I always think of living in other parts of the United States and the way food is prepared. And Ms. Chase is a classic example of that. My mother is, who also is a cook. And they would say that if the work doesn't look good, we won't eat it. And I think all of us in New Orleans grow up with that. And culturally, we don't realize how that impact on us. So you go to other places and people want to see more expressive marks or whatever within the work, but the fact is that that's not the culture we come out of. So there's a book called Fractals, which deals with all that in terms of New Orleans in particular, in terms of those African retentions and why we do things of that nature. So I'll just make that statement. The second thing I was very interested because I've only seen one installation by you. And the idea of the installation was such that you have to move just like you move when you're doing printmaking. So it's a dance there. But at the same time, you have to look at things not from a two-dimensional perspective, but from a three-dimensional perspective. And I wanted to know if you were going to do more installations, and how much does that idea of working within that 3D surrounding begin to inform your 2D prints? Because that becomes very, very important, because I see them all as one thing. I don't see printmaking different from painting, from sculpture, for whatever. It's all the same thing. It's just that you use different techniques, but you're doing this dance and you find a way. So the difference is the three-dimensional aspect is that you're looking at things like African sculpture from different points of view. So they change the way you see things. So I was interested in hopefully getting an explanation from you, because that has to change your way of seeing, as far as I'm concerned, and makes your work that much richer in terms of how you begin to even possibly go back to doing printmaking.
Thanks for that question, Mr. Birch. And yeah, I know the work you're talking about was at the NOAAM, and I wanted to fill the room so people did have to sort of dance between these works to get to the wall that had statistical information about New Orleans and images of Lincoln Beach and of Black prosperity and then Black disparity. And I really liked working with that thermal paper. It was still working with paper, interestingly enough, but paper that I could shape, something I could print, do a printmaking transfer on, and then shape and make into an installation. And I'm still really curious about doing 3D installations using materials meant for 2D display, and incorporating that into work. And so, the mirrored pieces play into that too, and thinking about how can those like undulate into different spaces to different areas in a space where you do have to, I like that. I make, not only are you drawn to the work because it's decorative and pretty, which is really important to me, spot on for sure. I want people to think it's pretty and then to read it. But then how can I manipulate how you move to that space also too with these 3D works, without like necessarily just putting something on the floor. As you noticed in NOAAM, nothing was on the floor. Things came to the floor, but nothing was on the floor. So yeah, I am thinking about that as I work on the this latest work about the 1811 uprising. Like, there's something about that work I want people to feel, and maybe it's because like my family members are in it, but like I want them to feel like a couple of things with it. And so thinking about that too. But yeah, it is hard to just thinking about printmaking once you've created something that comes off of a wall, for sure. And I'm, I did it again at the Halsey, and I keep thinking about like, how can I, space is an issue. How can I bring it into, what space is appropriate? How can I do that again? Space in my studio is an issue, not just like space in space.
Good evening. My name is Brandon Dorrington, and I am a descendant of some survivors of the Middle Passage. I'm a descendant of some survivors from slavery. And just briefly, as I was looking at your paintings, my ancestors felt a sense of relief, a sense of ease. I would say, I would have to use a few words like ventilation, rehabilitation, therapy from looking at these pictures. It's almost like, when someone goes through a traumatic experience, there's different type of rehabilitation methods in place. One of them in particular is called art therapy. So for me, I take this as a sense of therapy because as a descendant of a survivor of the Middle Passage, as a descendant of a survivor of former slaves, for 400, 500 years to pass, and just to think of the trauma that is in my DNA, the trauma that is in my cells from what they had to go through, and never having a period, a 1 year period, a 2 year period, or 5 year period, me as an individual, either other individuals, to go through a rehabilitation phase, a phase of healing from the trauma. And some people don't know how to deal with trauma. Some people don't even know how to admit that they may be suffering from trauma, from being a descendant of a Middle Passage survivor or someone of a slave descendant, being a descendant of a slave, that you may be going through some trauma that has never even been introduced to you because you may not be aware of it, or other people around you may not be aware of it. So I'm interested to know, since I felt, and my ancestors felt, a sense of ventilation, a sense of therapeutic relief from looking at your pictures, not just these two, but the other ones. Could this somehow be used to rehabilitate those in 2022 that are suffering from still trauma, still some type of mental illness from being a descendant of a Middle Passage survivor? Is it possible that you could think about therapeutic practices for those particular individuals based on your art and how it has made me feel some relief and my ancestors in this small period of time? Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question, Brandon. I think, I want to say that it's amazing that we're here. It is no small act that Black people are here. I am also enraged about our circumstances. So I'm amazingly enraged. And so if that is my therapy to, if it's anger management, then that's how I'm gonna phrase it and treat it. I haven't thought about therapeutics with it. I guess maybe, partly because of where I'm coming from when I'm creating the work, and also too, just in my studio is so therapeutic for me, and the act of making the work is a meditative process for me. Is also too, my children come down there and carve too. I didn't know what woodcut was until I was in college, and here come my 6-year-olds, also doing it, and they like doing it too, even though they don't, they don't understand the images behind the works. I talk to them about it if they want, if they ask me questions about it, but yeah, I'm amazed and I'm enraged at the same time, and I don't know how that works out to be therapy, but maybe it does.
That talking of therapeutic and healing and giving our time tonight, I think that'll be a great place to end our Q&A tonight. Let's please give a warm round of applause for our speakers tonight.
Thanks everyone for coming, and thank you, Katrina, for your amazing answers, the amazing work, and it's prompting me to to keep in touch more as we go on, and hopefully I can write something as well. So thanks everyone for coming. Thank you so much. Thank you.